There's so many horror stories out there, right, where people and families just, you know, create an absolute mess out of it because they didn't get the right advice. And obviously, the other side of the coin is, the public perception is you're paying too much for the advice. Jasmine, welcome, welcome, welcome. It's great to see you. Thanks very much for actually coming on board and actually be willing to have a chat. I'm really curious about family law and what it is that you do at VM Family Lawyers. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you came from, why did you end up becoming a lawyer, and any kind of other stories that you may want to add?
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you for having me. You've just asked that question. What made you become a lawyer? Look, I essentially was born in England. We moved out here when I was a teenager, started studying law at Griffith University. I didn't really know what I wanted to do when I started my degree, just sort of followed it through, got a few part-time jobs. And then I got an admin job, as you do when you first start out. And pretty much immediately I realised that family law was what I wanted to do. I really liked the work. The client contact was really interesting. And I felt like I was doing something important. When I suppose, moved through my degree, I had a few different jobs. I spent some time in Sydney, and I've been practicing with VM Family Law now for 2 years.
Fantastic.
So, yeah, it's been good.
Stuff. Well, I guess the key the thing that I really want to sort of drill down and get some information from you today is talk to us about divorce. I mean, we had a quick conversation a few days ago about this, and you came up with a few key things that I'd love for you to talk to us about, because I come into this quite naive, actually. So talk us through exactly what you said a few days ago. How do you break things down a little bit? Because I thought I sort of overstepped the mark a little bit, didn't I?
Look, initially what I would say is when you use the term divorce, that's one tiny little issue in family law. And what we say to clients is you've got to break it down. So you've got to look at what's your matter going to be. Have you got property together? Do you need to work out a property settlement? Have you got children together? Do you need some parenting orders in place or some other sort of agreement? And once you sort of divide it into those two categories, you've then got to break that down even further. So you've got to look at, what sort of issues are in your property settlement matter. Have you got complex corporate structures? Have you got trust structures? Are there issues in relation to spousal maintenance? Sometimes we look at child maintenance, although we try and leave that to the child support agency as much as we can.
Yes.
So what I would say initially is that we try not to use that term divorce in the sense that that's a very sort of specific, discrete issue where it really is that getting divorced. And it's a specific application, and it's normally quite a quick and efficient process. Not quite so much for the other matters with your property and parenting. But that's what I'd say initially in relation to that.
Okay, cool. So we've got property settlement as one thing to definitely consider, which comes with the complexities of having entities and that the like, having houses together and that kind of thing. And there's obviously time with the children as another matter. Was there another matter that I just missed there, or those are the two matters?
Not so much. Those are really the two, and then divorce is sort of separate on its own. So you can break it down to divorce, property settlement, and parenting matters.
Okay, cool. So just out of curiosity then, so what's the best way to maneuver through, I guess, initiating the separation process for someone who's sort of considering that this is the best course of action for them?
It's really client dependent, I find. It also depends on how amicable you are and whether or not you've discussed separation before. If it's something that is sort of, I suppose, arisen as a result of something like domestic violence, we have to look at whether or not raising the topic of separation is something that's going to cause more animosity between the parties, and whether or not we've got to look at any sort of safety concerns for clients, and if raising separation is going to cause an issue. For lots of clients, sometimes they come to me and say, oh, look, I've had this discussion with my partner, we're on board, we just want to get some advice, which is great. But often, unfortunately, you can't necessarily jump over that hurdle of one party getting a letter from a solicitor to say, oh, my ex-partner's got a lawyer now. And it really is case dependent. It just depends on how amicable the parties are and how they want to deal with their matter, and if they've spoken about it before, really. But I suppose first things first is always get legal advice. Always try and get as much information as possible about the options available to you, what your matter is going to be about, what the sticking points might be, so that before you raise it what you're in for.
Yeah, sure. So talk us through what does getting legal advice actually entail? Like, what's the typical process, so that the people out there who are considering this will know how to go about it, basically.
Yeah, look, lots of firms offer lots of different things. What we do here at VM is we offer different types of consultations. I mean, certainly at the moment we've sort of gotten into Zoom a little bit more than we ever have previously. But normally we offer two types of consultations. So we might say to a client, you can have a 15-minute free consultation where we try and answer some of those more burning questions for clients, and get a sort of general idea about how we might be able to help them. That, of course, doesn't give us enough time to give any sort of specific advice. So often what we would say to clients is, if you want some more specific advice about the law, come in and have a chat to us for an hour at a reduced fee, and we'll give you the relevant information regarding the law, and we'll try our best to, in the time frame, give you some advice about your matter.
Okay.
Normally it's all that information gathering to start with before we can, I suppose, give any advice. And that's really important, I suppose, in getting that advice, because if you don't know, you might make some decisions that you might not have made otherwise.
yeah, that you might regret, right? Because there's so many horror stories out there, right, where people and families just create an absolute mess out of it because they didn't get the right advice. And obviously, the other side of the coin is, the public perception is you're paying too much for the advice. But I think the key is to find the right ones. And I'm glad that there are that 15-minute kind of free phone call and that 1 hour discounted fee, so that people can actually go and look for the right lawyers who can help them out. Because I think one of the key things that you were mentioning in a previous conversation is you got to be in sync with your clients, and the clients and the people who are looking to get separation has to be in sync with the lawyers that they're working with too. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. You've got to, I suppose, be able to have a relationship with your lawyer that's going to work. You've got to feel comfortable in communicating. You, as a client, you've got to feel that you can trust your lawyer. You want to feel that they're up to date with all the relevant knowledge that they need to have. And also it's got to relate, on a personal level. And part of what we're about here is that, as you can see, I'm fairly casual today, and that's pretty much how we are, unless we're at court or mediations. And we try to be a little bit more relatable to clients, and have that sort of friendly approach. And it's sort of case by case and client by client as to what sort of firm and what sort of services they might need.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So, I guess, so you mentioned about property settlement and parenting. So let's go down the property settlement path. Let's run a hypothetical, right? So a scenario where young couple got 1 or 2, potentially 3 kids, depending on who they are. Let's just call it 2, right? 2 kids. They have their house. They've bought their house 10 years ago, let's hypothetically say, and they're going through a bit of a rough patch. They've tried multiple times to sort of seek counseling and that kind of stuff. They're at that stage now. It's amicable, right? So let's run with an amicable scenario versus a not so amicable scenario. How would it look in terms of the house being divided and assets being divided for the property settlement side of things?
Look, it's a tough question to answer because it is so case dependent. With property settlement matters, I suppose it depends on what both parties have. So first steps first is we've got to work out what they've both got before we can start sort of singling out what's going to happen to the house, so to speak. And often the family home is something that both parties are particularly attached to. If you've raised a family there, it's something that both parties might want to keep. One party might want nothing to do with it anymore. They might want it to be sold. And those sorts of questions we sort of try and, get our clients instructions about what it is that they want and see if we can achieve that. But really from I suppose, an advice perspective, there's so many things that form into whether or not one party is going to keep the family home or whether or not it's going to be sold. So it's sort of unanswerable in that respect, but it does sort of look at, can one party refinance it is probably one of the first questions we would ask. Have you got that capacity to be able to refinance? And if they haven't got that information, we might say to them, okay, well, look, first things first, you might want to go and see someone and talk to a mortgage broker and get that information. If it's the case that neither party wants anything to do with it, then we've got to look at, if it's being sold, how much equity is in there. And I suppose when we start talking about equity, we've got to look at what else is in the property pool as to whether or not one party is going to keep a lot of those sale proceeds or what's going to happen with it. So I know that sort of potentially dodged around the question a little bit, but it's one of those things that you can't really answer.
Yeah, until you got the specifics, right? So that makes perfect sense. So I guess, like, in terms of the range, like, the thing that comes to my mind is, what does a percentage look for the man and the woman, let's say, or what for this particular couple, let's say, do they come up with a percentage breakdown of their assets first and foremost, right? Listed out, I'm assuming, and then from there, do you start does it typically work like this, where they start where you start the process where they were financially when they met, right, or when they get married, and then up to where they got to what they built during the time that they're together? Is that how it typically works? Or
look, typically the way that we work through it is essentially going through what's called the 4-step process. That's essentially what we call it. So those things that you just listed out are what we call the contribution factors.
Yes.
And those things are particularly relevant when we start looking at percentages. So to answer your question in terms of whether or not parties can say, well, this is what I want to do, absolutely. And often in terms of resolving your matter, that's the most cost-effective way to do it, is you come up with what it is that you say you should split the pool as, split your assets, liabilities and super, and then come and get some legal advice about what that looks legally and whether or not that's something that the court's going to make. So that 4-step process is probably something for an entirely separate seminar, in all honesty. But it's one of those things where we do look at all of those individual factors for each couple. And depending on what's happened during the relationship and depending how long that relationship is, and depending on what both parties need into the future, is really going to impact what that percentage split looks like.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, it sounds to me as if there's a whole bunch of seminars that we could potentially run in the future. We'll see how we go. Okay, so I guess next question is, so we've talked about a little bit about the property settlement side. How about the parenting side of things in terms of percentage? Like, what's the typical kind of scenario? Obviously, we're talking generalizations here, but what's the typical scenario? What's the most common kind of outcome for a bland kind of divorce? It's typically amicable, let's say. Bland's probably the wrong word, but yeah, I'm sure you'll forgive me for that.
No, that's fine. Look, again, it's so hard because you might have a family that's got 2 children, for example. And it depends on, those kids might be old, those kids might be young. One parent might live interstate. One parent might do shift work. You've got all kinds of different factors that will form part of what a time arrangement might look like on a final basis.
Sure, yes.
When we, I suppose, look at these sort of matters, if they're not in court, then, parties often do come to us and say, well, look, this is what's been happening since we've separated. We're happy with this. Can you give us some advice around whether or not the court's likely to say yes or no to that? But look, essentially with parenting matters, it could range anywhere from equal time at 50-50 to whatever suits that particular family. It might be the case that, if one party does do shift work, that you work it around a roster. And I guess it's going to depend on, of course, children have a right to have a meaningful relationship with both parents. So you've got to make sure that that's being facilitated. But it's also got to work within the particular family too.
Yes.
So
Sorry, you keep
No,
going.
yeah, it's really a difficult one to answer because no family's the same, no kids are the same.
Yes, of course, of course.
Um,
So I guess the takeaway for me for that one is, like, if it's amicable, if both parties are comfortable about talking it through and coming up with a solution, you can typically get the solution over the line if everyone's happy. So on the other side of the coin, if the couple isn't happy, like what options do they have? Is it straight to court? Is it mediation? Like how does the kind of process work for these kinds of couples?
yeah, I mean, look, I suppose it depends on how amicable or not amicable they are.
Yes.
But certainly, court's never the first option. Court would only ever be the first option if there's circumstances surrounding risk, or significant domestic violence. Those are the only real circumstances where we would give any advice to say court might be the best option at this point in time. Normally, what we would say to clients is these are your options. So you've got negotiation. So, you can sit down between yourselves if you want and have a chat. Although most people that are, I suppose, separated don't necessarily want to do that, hence why they come and see solicitors.
Sure.
So we might say to them, okay, well, we can correspond with the other party on your behalf, and we can see if we can get an agreement. And we follow through our processes to make sure that our clients have got the necessary advice they need, to then put a proposal forward. So that's one option. And I suppose from a cost perspective, depends on how reasonable both parties are and how
Sure.
much they want to argue as to
Yeah.
how cost effective that process is. If negotiation's not going anywhere, we often suggest some other forms of dispute resolution. Mediation is the most common. There are other alternatives such as arbitration, which is, I suppose, slightly more aligned with an outcome you might receive from the court, in the sense that it's a binding outcome. But look, usually mediation is the next step. And ideally, what we want to achieve is consent orders, which is an agreement in writing between the parties, gets stamped and sealed by the court. And that's usually the most cost-effective way for parties to resolve their dispute without having to go to court. Now,
Yes.
sometimes that doesn't happen, and you might
Sure.
go through those processes and end up in court anyway. But certainly from our perspective, if we can avoid going to court,
Yeah.
that's essentially what we are all about. No one wants to be.
You aim to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes it can't be avoided, and sometimes you have to do it. But if we can focus on a resolution without court proceedings, that's the best way for everyone. And certainly, it saves, whether it's our clients and the other party, it saves both of them, I suppose, the emotional turmoil of going through court proceedings. And it saves a significant amount of legal fees.
Yes. That's
and
it.
wait
Exactly.
time. The courts are busy. You don't file in court and get an answer immediately.
Yes, I'm with you. Okay, so we've talked about the time arrangement, we talked about court. Now, I guess the financial side of things, I'm curious, how does it work? There's a bunch of words that come to my mind, like alimony. What is that? Like, how does it work? Is that even the right word? Like, there's obviously, for example, if the man has no time with the children, I'm assuming that person, the dad, will have to at least chip in to bring the kids up, right? And vice versa, right? So how does that work?
Dipping into child support.
Child support, yes.
Child support's one of those sticking points I find with some clients. It's something that, from a property settlement perspective, I suppose, comes into consideration as to, is one party paying it, is one party receiving it? But it's something that is dealt with through the child support agency, and it's something where the parties, I suppose not always, so sometimes you can draft what's called a binding child support agreement, which deals with child support. But ultimately, that's normally something that's dealt with the child support agency. And whilst it's relevant, it's not the overriding factor that's going to decide your property settlement matter or your parenting matter for that point of view.
Okay, cool. And in terms of the costs associated with that, is that a percentage of salary? Is it a fixed cost for the party who's not spending as much time with the children? Is there like a tiered cost associated with it?
With child support?
Yes, with child support.
Look, I'm not going to speak to how the child support agency, I suppose, determines who pays what. And certainly from my understanding, it's got something to do with income and time, in the sense that, it'll be, some people will come to me and say, I've got 75% care of my children. And I say, what does that mean? And they say, well, that's what's on the child support assessment. And we very much try and steer clients away from that point of view. So we try and say, well, don't think of it as a child support percentage. Sure, that might be the amount that you've got to pay or you've got to receive, but the time arrangements are very different to that. So look, that's one of those sort of interesting points that comes up sometimes. But look, I can't really speak to the child support agency's determination of each particular party's circumstances.
Yep. Okay, well, that's a great point, because I wasn't even aware that there was that agency. I'm completely ignorant about this whole process. Thank you for just teaching me about all of these things. It's awesome. Next question that I have is in terms of the financial implications of the separation. There's obviously the property settlement. There's obviously fees that they'd have to pay for professionals and advice and help. Potential mortgage application fees if they were to refinance the home and that kind of stuff. What are the other kind of sneaky little costs that come in and just hit the bottom line for these families?
I think a lot of that probably comes down to, have the parties got any financial advice? And one of the big things is you might agree on a property settlement, and we can give you legal advice about what that property settlement means. We can't give you financial advice about what the financial implications of that settlement are. In terms of those sort of sneaky costs, sometimes things relating to superannuation splits. So if one party's superannuation is being split to the other party, there's some back-end costs in affecting that. You've got it's called procedural fairness, but essentially what you've got to do is send a copy of the orders of your agreement to the superannuation trustee to ask if they've got any objection to the orders. So those sorts of things, little fees here and there associated with that, can sneak in. You might have, I suppose, other fees associated with Department of Main Roads or Titles Office in lodging various transfer documents if you're transferring a car out of your name or if you're transferring a property. Those are quite common, and that's where we start looking at, referring clients out as well and making sure that they're getting those services that they need. And I think that's probably one of those, I suppose, sometimes parties come to you and they think that you can do everything. And sometimes they will look, we're family law here. You might need commercial lawyer over here. You might need estate planning lawyer over here. And you might need conveyancing lawyer over here. So that's what I would say, is that sometimes couples or clients think that the family law costs will encompass everything, and often they get a little bit of, we try and make sure they don't have that shock, but sometimes parties are shocked at the end where they see all the additional work to actually implement their agreement.
Yeah, well, I can imagine. And that's the thing. I think the common misconception is every lawyer does the same thing, and you go to one and all your problems should be solved. At least the public seems to think that they pay one bill and everything goes away, but it's not necessarily the case, right? Because
not quite.
There's different specializations. Wouldn't it be nice? I mean, I'm sure. Are there law firms out there that do everything?
Look, I think there are some general law firms out there that do, I suppose, many aspects of law.
Sure. Okay.
I suppose it depends on how big you are. I mean, for us, we're sort of a smaller team, and we're happy doing family law and domestic violence.
Sure. It's a specialist versus generalist kind of idea as well. And as a client, you need to sort of decide what works best for you, whether it be a generalist or a specialist, because ultimately it comes down to your decision as a person, I guess, to work with someone who works day in, day out with particular issues versus someone who may look at it once a month or once every few weeks. So yeah, okay, that's interesting. I wrote down a note here: stamp duty. What is stamp duty? You mentioned transfers. Where does that sit in this particular process? If there's, let's hypothetically say, mum and dad broke up. Dad is happy to transfer the title, the name on the title to mum, and mum can afford to refinance. Let's hypothetically say. Are there stamp duties that she needs to pay for his half? Let's hypothetically say.
So, if you de facto or married, if you resolve your property settlement matter under the Family Law Act, you are exempt from transfer duty.
Okay, right.
So, look, that's a major
one bit of good news, I guess.
Look, that's one incentive for I suppose, parties to resolve their disputes. You know, and lots of people don't want to engage a lawyer and don't want to resolve matters, and you know that comes with a whole range of other risks that I won't go into. But things like your stamp duty exemption is a really big thing for some people, particularly if they do a lot of the back work themselves in terms of the agreement and things like that, and they need you to, you know, do the relevant documents and give them the advice. It still could save them thousands of dollars in stamp duty.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you talked about risks there, and you said you don't want to go into I'm all about really risk mitigating, right? So
yeah.
So can you share? Are you capable of sharing a few of these risks? Because really, the way I see it is like if people don't get help, like they can literally put themselves in a hole without even knowing it, right?
Yeah.
And then 5, 10, 15 years down the track, they realize, oh crap, I could have gotten out of it. I could have done X, Y, Z. I could be $100,000 better off, $10,000 better off, whatever it may be, just by pulling one lever or making one little pivot at the start of the process. Do you mind sharing one or two little stories that may help the audience decide to get help?
Yeah. I suppose the most common one is, getting a divorce. So hypothetically, if you get a divorce, you've then only got 12 months post your divorce order being granted to deal with your property settlement matter. So let's say fairly amicable, you're still living in the former matrimonial home. You've decided you don't want to deal with your assets and your liabilities, and let's say 4 or 5 years passes. What then happens is that you pass what we call the limitation date. So you're then technically outside of when you can deal with your property settlement matter under the Family Law Act. There are exceptions, but it makes life much more difficult. And it means that you could be open to assets that you have at that point in time. Let's say, for example, you separated, you got divorced, you didn't deal with your house, and then you got a large inheritance. You know, those are the sorts of issues where it's always dangling over your head. And I think that's the major point, is that the aim of the property settlement is to sever your financial relationship forever.
Yes,
and if
sure.
it's not severed, then, you know, things like inheritances and I suppose generally dealing with your matter does become complicated. You know, you might want to sell your property. And if the other party doesn't agree, you've got some issues there if you're still on the title together. And you just don't want to have to deal with that.
Yeah, fair enough. Absolutely. So one thing that sort of piqued my interest there is you mentioned divorce orders, 12-month kind of time frame. So to go through a divorce, one needs to put in some kind of paperwork and then wait for 12 months. Is that how it works? It's not separate for 12 months and then go through the divorce process. You need to have that 12-month time frame post putting in the paperwork. Is that right?
So essentially the way that it works is if you want to get divorced, you have to have been separated for a period of 12 months.
I see.
can get a little bit complicated if you've been separated under one roof during that time period.
Okay.
Once you've been separated for 12 months, you can apply for divorce. So there's a particular set of documents that you use. Once you've had your divorce hearing, you essentially get 1 month and 1 day before your divorce order comes into effect.
Okay.
Some people do reconcile during that period.
Yes. Okay.
But once you've got your divorce order, once that's been issued and you're divorced, you've then only got 12 months from that date to deal with your property settlement matter.
I see.
And if it's the case that, say, 2 months before that 12-month period is up after you've gotten divorced and you've still not resolved your property settlement matter, that's where we then start getting into that space of, do you have to file court proceedings to essentially preserve your interests? That's when we start looking at, court becomes more important in those circumstances.
So during that property settlement, so you've got 12 months post-divorce orders, right, to
Yep.
get that property settlement organized. If the couple doesn't have any assets, right, don't have any assets, what is it fairly straightforward kind of process for them? And assuming they don't have kids either, is it fairly kind of cut and dry?
If they don't have assets, did you say?
Yes.
I suppose it depends on what they do have. So, if they've got lots of debt together, you would want to get that, I suppose, resolved in terms of who's keeping the debt. Is it one person's debt? Is it joint debt? But I suppose in terms of, if you've not got any assets, and when I say no assets, most people sort of, usually have a car or something. They might not necessarily have real property, which is, a family home or something like that. But normally you don't find that people have no assets. But still, even then, it's important to resolve your matter, because what if one party then buys a house? That's then an asset. So you're sort of then stuck in that space where you can't necessarily resolve your property settlement matter, because you always know, oh wait, what if he does this, or what if she does that? And
yes.
Yeah.
So there needs to be an end point, a finalization, cut ties, see you later. You guys kind of go your own financial and lifestyle way, basically.
And that's, for clients, that's peace of mind too. Your property settlement's done, you've separated your finances, you can keep living your life, the other party can live their life, and you can both move on, because there's nothing worse than having to constantly worry about, well, what's happening with that joint bank account over there, or what's happening with that asset over there, has that been sold, what's happened with that cash,
Sure. Okay. So in terms of, I guess, the fees that families could expect, like, it's so basically they're covering off on potential mortgage broking fees, obviously lawyer fees if they're getting advice, potential financial planning fees, most likely accounting fees if they're breaking down the assets, kind of thing, potential superannuation kind of trustee, potential fees, exit fees, that kind of thing. So is there a general rule that people could expect to sort of pay or a roundabout mark to expect to be able to get it done from A to Z? And what's the cheapest, what's the most expensive, that kind of thing? It's obviously a very general question. If there's an idea for some of them, I think it would
it's so hard. Look, what I would say is that you could probably have a matter that's going to range anywhere from 5,000 at your simple end to 100,000, potentially more at the more complex end.
Sure.
It's really going to depend on, are you in court? Are you out of court? How amicable are you? How, reasonable do you both want to be in terms of, potentially giving over relevant documents and, responding to questions that need answering? All of those things increase your legal fees if they're, I suppose, if someone's dragging the chain, for want of a better word.
Okay.
So, for someone who has done a lot of the back work and says, well, here's my agreement, I need some advice and I need to do up the relevant documents, it can be fairly cost effective. But at the same time, there's no guarantee that we don't get the relevant documents from the client and then say, hang on a minute, what you've agreed to isn't right. So it's a very difficult one to answer. We try to offer for our clients, we try to offer some fixed fees where we can, to try and give clients that peace of mind that for that particular, I suppose, aspect of the property settlement or the parenting matter, they know that component's going to cost X amount.
Sure.
And we try to do that so that, there's no unexpected fees. We do often say to clients, though, if you're in negotiation phase, it's really hard to sort of fix that cost.
Yeah, I bet.
Because it's really dependent upon how the other party wants to engage, if they want to engage at all.
I mean,
so
that's the
again,
thing, like if they want to fight, holy crap, sorry to interrupt, but if they want to fight and if it's not amicable at all, it can really drag out, right? So,
yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing. And sometimes it's so difficult when you hear from clients, I'm not getting anywhere. And sometimes it is really hard because no one wants to start court proceedings. No one wants to be in that litigation phase. But sometimes the costs of negotiating for such a long period of time and not getting anywhere, you got to put a stop to it at some point.
Yeah. Okay. Right. And I guess the role of advisors and part of that team is obviously you're acting on the best interest of your client. So that's pretty much the number one priority. So assuming the same thing for the others, and if there's infighting happening, there's really a low chance of getting to a solution straight away. So it's going to drag out. It's going to take a few conversations, maybe some therapy. Who knows? Like it could really drag out, right? So would you say that the first port of call for couples who are trying to minimize the damage, at least the financial damage for themselves, their families, and the next generations, is to work on an amicable kind of a relationship first and foremost, and an amicable separation, and then go ahead and get everything done? Is that what you would advise people to do?
Look, I mean, I would not necessarily give, I suppose, a client advice to say, okay, well, you should both go and see, a counsellor or someone to, I suppose, improve your relationship. It does become, I suppose, a bit more relevant with parenting matters, because sometimes, obviously, if you're not amicable, that can create some issues in terms of your parenting matter. So in that respect, yes. From a property settlement perspective, not so much in terms of the advice to go and see a counsellor. It's always beneficial, I think, for clients if they've just recently separated to have that ability to be able to vent.
Yes.
And of course, the more amicable you are, the easier the process is going to be.
Yeah. Okay. Yep.
And look, I suppose what I would say is, there's importance in terms of getting all of the advice from all the relevant people. So, getting your financial advice and getting that information from your mortgage broker and all of those things that you can do to set yourself up so that when you go and see your lawyer, you go, yep, okay, so I know these things about my financial position. I know these things about where I need to be at the end of my matter. Can you get me there?
That's a really good segue into one of the questions that I'd like to ask, actually. So how would one go about finding the right team, and who are the professionals in that team? So you alluded to financial advisors, potential mortgage brokers. Is it accountant? Definitely some solicitors. Yep. Like who's in that team?
As in specific firms that we refer to, or?
No, just in general. What are the professionals basically that should be as a potential divorcee? What are the professionals that you need on your side to make sure that you're not shooting yourself in the foot first and foremost?
Look, I suppose it does depend on your matter. So if you've got lots of corporate structures and things like that, then you're probably going to want to have your commercial lawyer on board. That's really important as well for us. We don't give commercial law advice. We're family lawyers here. So if a client says to me, okay, well, here's my shareholders agreement, or this is what my company structure looks like, I can't give that client advice about their particular, director duties or anything like that. They need their commercial lawyer to be able to speak to them about that. So you want to have your commercial lawyer on board if that's, you've got those entities. Your accountant is always important, particularly in property settlement matters. Your tax returns and those sorts of documents are one of the documents that often get disclosed between each parties. So making sure you've got all of that relevant information and making sure, I suppose, that everything's up to date. And again, if you've got complex structures, you're going to want your accountant on board. Also to, I suppose, give you some tax advice too.
So there's obviously there's commercial lawyer for couples and families who have multiple entities. There's the accountant, typically for the majority of people, because both parties have to see through the full financials, I'm assuming. There's the family law lawyers as well.
Yeah.
Right?
Look, at the end of your matter, you'd probably then be looking at your estate planning lawyers.
Okay.
I guess, your estate planning lawyers and I suppose your conveyancing solicitors, if you're going, dealing with a transfer of your property or the sale of your property.
Okay.
Those sort of come more at the end of your matter.
Sure.
But you've got to have them. And always our recommendation is, if you've got a will and you've separated, you want to go speak to an estate planning lawyer about what your will says, and you might need to make some changes.
Okay, cool. And for couples out there who are looking to bootstrap this thing, all amicable, trying to get it done for as little to no cost as possible, how would they go about doing that?
Look, I suppose what we always say to clients is the most cost-effective way to deal with your matter is to make sure you deal with everything properly. So, and I do hear this from clients sometimes where they say, look, I just want to deal with it. I just want it done. I don't want to do that process. I don't want to get this advice. And I suppose what I would say is that, sure, that might ultimately save you some initial costs, but potentially you're going to incur yourself some more costs later down the track by not getting the relevant legal advice. So I suppose to answer your question is find a lawyer that works for you, get the relevant legal advice and do the things that your lawyer tells you to do. And that's going to mean that your settlement's going to be cost effective. Because if you're following those steps, we don't tell people to do things just because we want them to do things. We're telling them to do things because it's our recommendation that they do it to protect their interests.
Yes.
So certainly from a other services sort of point of view and getting your financial advice, we're always going to recommend that regardless of your matter. We're always going to say if you're going through a property settlement, you're going to want financial advice. You're going to want to make sure that what you're doing is going to ensure that you're still financially stable at the end of it and moving forward.
So off the back of that, then, like, of that recommendation, what if let's say the financial advisor crunched a few numbers and said, well, this isn't fair. Does that force, that must happen all the time, right? And does that force the negotiation to go backwards a couple of steps to sort of make sure that every party gets a fair shake kind of thing? Or that's a possibility, I'm assuming.
Look, I guess it depends on what fair means.
Yes, I see.
Fair from a financial, I suppose, advice point of view in terms of where that person might want to be sitting is likely to be very different to what we don't necessarily call it fair. It's called just and equitable, but that might be very different under the Family Law Act. So, we might say to clients, okay, well, look, based on the information you've told us, your range of entitlement might be here. And then if they go and see their financial advisor and they say, well, that's not enough, then I suppose what I would say is then you've got to look at the way the settlement is structured. So is it because there's no cash component coming to that client? Is it because they're giving up super and that's going to affect their investment options or their retirement and things like that? So that's what I would say about that is it's not so much about if a financial advisor says, okay, well, you need more out of the settlement. It's what's the settlement look like and what do you need to ensure that you're set up? And at the end of the day, sometimes you might get financial advice, legal advice, commercial law advice, but if you can't agree, it makes it hard.
Yeah, I bet. Okay, and so you mentioned super there. Just out of curiosity, let's say that same couple got a few kids, got house, they had a property settlement, and part of that is super. Let's say he's got $300,000 more than she does. She's got 50,000. She's got 350, and they decide to give her 100,000. Everyone's happy. Does that 100,000 go into her superannuation account, or does that go into her pocket?
Well, I'm not going to speak to the, I suppose, rules in relation to when you can access your superannuation.
Sure.
And certainly I know that there are different funds out there and they do different things depending on their structure. But I suppose if it's a superannuation split where you're not eligible to withdraw your super, then it's super. So you might roll it over into your fund if you've got one, or you might roll it into, or you might create a super account with the superannuation that the member has, and the other party that's giving you the super, you might sort of set up a fund with them. But if you're not eligible to withdraw it, you're not eligible to withdraw it.
Yeah, fair enough. Got me excited there for a second. Yeah, you got to play within the boundaries, right? Within the rules.
And look, and that's where, if you get some, you might get some advice from a commercial lawyer or someone that I suppose specialises in self-managed super funds and things like that to work out what your best options are. If you're going to have a superannuation split, what do you do with that super? What's going to set you up to have your best investment, I suppose?
Sure.
And we can't do that.
Yes. So do you mind sharing a few common misconceptions about divorce and separation for us?
Yeah. I suppose the one that I hear the most is it'll be 50-50 down the middle property settlement.
Yeah, sure.
And I suppose I don't really know where that comes from, but that's certainly not the case.
I think it's from movies, like American movies. 50-50, it always seems to come up, right? A lot of people see it and think, oh, it must be the same in Australia. It's probably not the same. It's probably not the case in America either, right? So yeah, it sounds to me as if there's so many, well, it's looking at all of the variables, right? And then creating that just and equitable kind of end result. So yeah, okay.
Look,
So
that's the main one. Others are, I suppose, parents saying their rights to spend time with their children, which it's a child's right, not a parent's right.
Sure. Yes.
I suppose one of them is that the kids will always live with mum. That's probably another one.
Yeah. Okay.
And I suppose sometimes the effect of, if you've got a matter which involves domestic violence or matters that involve risk factors. So let's say, drugs, alcohol, mental health, that if those issues exist, a child might not spend time with that parent. Whereas it's more about how can a child spend time with that parent if the risk is mitigated, if there are things that parent does to ensure that they can provide for a safe environment and they don't pose a risk. It's not so much about, well, I've got that issue with that parent and I say this, so therefore they shouldn't have time.
In terms of common misconceptions and actual results, it really comes down to property settlement and obviously time with the children and making sure that they're safe. And those are the two big sort of results that everyone's aiming for a just and equitable kind of result, right?
Look, and I think from I always try and separate them up. I think, yes, they blend together in the sense that, what parenting arrangements you've got are going to somewhat impact what you might need in the future from your property settlement, but certainly they are separate. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Cool. So last question before we finish up. So what would you recommend someone do to prepare for one, separation or divorce, minimize damage and get a better outcome throughout the process and after?
I think it all comes back to getting the appropriate legal advice. So
of course you'd say that.
Look, I think it comes down to information. Information. Yeah.
Yes. And that's where legal advice comes in, because obviously it's essentially knowing, like I always go back to knowing the rules of the game so that you can play the game better, right? So if the outcome that you want is maximize financial, output at the end of it and maximize time with children and a fair and equitable kind of result for both parties, you have to go through a lawyer because you could really bodge things up. That's a finance technical term. If you're not careful.
Yeah, I know that coming to seeing a lawyer is quite daunting for some. And it's that first step that they're taking, you know, often recognizing that their relationship has ended and realizing that they've got to go through all these processes to get to the end of their matter. But if you don't have the relevant information, you don't have the right advice, it'll probably cost you more and it'll probably cause you more stress. So, you know, and find a lawyer that's right for you.
Okay. So with that in mind, then, is it like, so there's obviously the assets, there's the fees associated with getting advice. How does the fee structure work? Is it an upfront, or is there a payment at the end of the settlement, or are there payments throughout, kind of thing? What should these people expect, I should say, in terms of fees and paying for fees?
Look, it's client dependent. We offer a range of different things depending on clients' particular circumstances.
Sure.
Usual process is that you have money in trust in order for us to work on a file.
Okay.
But that's, having said that, that doesn't mean that there's not options out there in terms of assisting clients that are not in a position to be able to afford those upfront legal fees. But it's different for every client. So it's so hard to particularize things like that. And what I would say is that those are the sorts of things we try and work out when we meet with clients. We try and work out what their current situation is so that we can work out a way that we can work with them and they can work with us to get them to an outcome.
Right, and that's part and parcel of what you mentioned before, which is 15-minute phone call, have a quick chat, organize, if it's a good fit for both parties, organize another meeting in the office, discounted 1 hour thing, and then explore a little bit further. If it's a yes, this is a good fit for us, let's move forward and just go through each process. And I'm assuming every single law firm's got a different process, but close enough to that particular mark. Yeah, so it's a comfort thing as well. Yeah,
everyone's different, and it might be the case that, you know, it's a matter where we can do up a fixed fee agreement, which essentially covers everything. You know, if it's sort of at the end of negotiation phase and it's looking at settlement, but we don't know that till we meet with clients. And you know, as well, sometimes it's good to get that advice if you think that you've done all the things you need to, and then there's something that we might say, hang on a minute, you've not done that and you really need to do that.
It's a peace of mind thing as well, right? Like it's you may as well cover all scenarios, because you could be missing out on something quite significant if you're not careful.
But look, fees is a tough one. Fees is always that's at the forefront of lots of clients' mind when they come in. They need to know how much it's going to cost them. So we do our best to give an estimate based on hourly rates or a fixed fee. You know, we do our best to make that clear, but it's always so hard. It's always very hard. Yeah.
But it's look as far as the client's concerned, it's really, I mean, I don't want to sort of choose the wrong words here, but it's a necessary evil as far as they're concerned, right? It's not necessarily evil for our side, for your side of things, because you're providing solid advice and recommendations that's actually putting them in a best situation. But without knowing that, to them, I'm assuming it's really just a massive cost that they don't necessarily want to take on. Not realizing without taking it on, they're putting themselves in a position to lose even more, right? So it's one of those things where communication and meetings like this, you know, videos like this will make it a little bit easier for people who are considering these things, because it's accessible. You know, a lot of unfortunately, a lot of people in the public seem to think that they're going to get slogged at every single juncture. You know, so it's good that you guys are providing that 15-minute phone call and that discounted hour, because it just allows them to see the lay of the land at the very least, and really kind of plan with confidence rather than massive uncertainty, you know.
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, you can only put the information out there. You know, and hope that people think, oh, look, I better go get that advice. You know, I've got to think about my interests. But you can't force them to.
No, certainly not. You can only, what's the expression? You can only lead a horse to water. You can't force it to drink, right? So that's just the way it goes. Yeah, very similar thing in the financial advisory world. Well, I think that's us for today. Thanks very much for your time. Before we finish up, I guess what I'd love to ask from you is where can the audience reach out to you? Like, what's your website? Do you guys have social media handles that the audience can follow? Where can we reach you?
There's a range of ways. Look, we have a website which is www.bmfamilylaw.com.au. There's the ability to be able to book appointments through the website. We also have a booking system with LawTap, so you can book appointments with myself or Kath, who's our principal. We are available on Facebook. We have a VM Family Law Facebook page. Myself and Kath have LinkedIn profiles.
Sure. Yeah.
And I believe that's it. We do have, there's a system or an operating system called Setify, which is I think another booking system which enables you to be able to complete some, I think, preliminary information to send to us if you book through that website. So those, I suppose, are the obvious ones.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, what I'll do is I'll grab all those details off you and put it in the description below this video so that people can click through and follow the links if they want to come and speak to you. Thanks very much for your time once again, Jasmine. It's been quite great, quite good to get to know about the whole process. And I'm sure a lot of the audience who are considering getting a separation and a divorce are now armed with a little bit more information, which is always a good thing, because information is what it's all about these days, right? The knowing what your options are is key to ensure that your end outcome is preferable. So
absolutely.
Thanks again.
Thank you very much for having me.
Brilliant. Well, looking forward to organising one of those extra seminars for the more detailed kind of, exactly, the 4-step process and the like. So we'll see how we go from here on out. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll see you very soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jasmine. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
All right, guys, that's Jasmine Evans from VM Family Law. Hopefully you found that information or that webinar, that video, quite useful. If you want to see me interview and talk to other kinds of professionals, make sure you click on, or you comment below and share some of your thoughts, and any kind of questions that you want to ask, just fire them at me and I'll make sure to bring in the right professional in to answer all of these questions. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to sharing another interview with you in the very near future. Cheers.